The cold steel of the ladder rung bit into my palms as the train jolted, nearly tossing me into the hungry sea of gray skin and gnashing teeth below. I kicked out hard, my heavy work boot connecting with a jawbone that shattered like dry glass. The creature fell back, disappearing into the blur of the gravel track, but there were dozens more clinging to the sides of the Union Pacific freight cars. This wasn't a commute anymore. It was a rolling coffin. I hauled myself onto the roof of the boxcar, my lungs burning in the freezing Nebraska air. My name is Elias, and I've been trapped on this moving hell pipe for 3 days. Or maybe it's 4. When the world ended at the Chicago rail yards, I didn't have a plan. I just had a jump start on a moving train. Now, I have a rusted pipe wrench, half a gallon of lukewarm water, and 1,000 miles of track ahead of me. The first thing you learn about surviving on a train during the end of the world is that sound is your worst enemy. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels is a dinner bell. Every time we slow down for a bend or a rusted-out signal, they swarm. I crawled toward the gap between cars, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to get inside. The wind-up here was stripping the heat from my body, and I could see a massive storm front building on the horizon. I reached the coupling and looked down. A woman, or what used to be one, was wedged between the cars, her torso crushed by the shifting weight, but her arms were still reaching, her fingers scraping against the metal. I didn't feel pity. I felt the weight of my wrench. One heavy swing stilled her. I dropped into the gap, sliding the heavy steel door of the car open just enough to squeeze through. It smelled like dry corn and old grease. This was a grain car, mostly empty, but it offered cover. I slid the door shut and jammed a piece of rebar into the track. For now, I was safe. But safe is a relative term when you're moving at 60 miles per hour toward a dead world. Day 5 was when the hunger really started to claw at my gut. I'd found a few handfuls of dry corn in the corners of the car, but it was hard as gravel and tasted like dirt. I needed real calories. I knew the third car back was a refrigerated unit. If the generator was still humming, there might be something edible. Getting there meant crossing 2 flatbeds loaded with rusted farm equipment. I waited for a straight stretch of track where the swaying was minimal. I stepped out into the wind, the wrench gripped so tight my knuckles were white. Movement caught my eye. A figure was perched on a tractor on the first flatbed. It wasn't moving like a person. It was hunched, its spine curved like a bow. As I approached, it snapped its head toward me. No eyes, just empty sockets filled with black rot. It let out a dry, rattling hiss and lunged. I didn't have room to dodge. I swung the wrench in a wide arc, catching it mid-air. The impact vibrated up my arm, but the thing didn't stop. It tackled me, its weight pinning me against the cold iron of the tractor wheel. Its teeth snapped inches from my throat, the smell of its breath like a stagnant pond. I shoved my forearm against its neck, feeling the wet, leathery skin. With my free hand, I fumbled for the knife I'd lashed to my belt, a sharpened file I'd ground down on the train's floor. I drove it upward, through the bottom of its chin and into the brain. The body went limp. I pushed it off, gasping for air, watching as it rolled off the side of the train and bounced into the dark woods. I made it to the reefer car. The lock was heavy-duty, but the hinges were rusted. I spent 3 hours hammering at them with the wrench, every blow echoing like a gunshot. It was a dangerous gamble. Each strike brought more of them to the sides of the car. I could hear their fingernails scratching against the exterior, a sound like 1,000 dry leaves. Finally, the hinge snapped. I pried the door open. Inside wasn't food. It was bodies. Dozens of them, piled high. They had been workers trying to hide. But one of them had been turned before the doors shut. It was a slaughterhouse. But at the very back, under a pile of blood-stained coats, I found a crate of vacuum-sealed beef jerky and a gallon of industrial-strength Gatorade. I grabbed what I could and scrambled back to my grain car just as the train began to slow. That's the problem with the rail lines now. No one is at the switches. The automated systems are failing. We were heading into a bottleneck, a rail yard outside of Omaha. I climbed to the roof to see the damage. The tracks ahead were clogged with stalled engines and burning tankers. The engineer, if he was even still alive in the armored cab, slammed on the brakes. The screech of metal on metal was deafening. The freight cars slammed into each other, a chain reaction of kinetic energy that nearly threw me 100 feet. As the train ground to a halt, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then, I heard it. From the woods on both sides of the tracks, the brush started to move. Thousands of them. A sea of gray moving toward the stalled steel giant. I wasn't trapped on a train anymore. I was trapped in a cage, and the lions were hungry. I scrambled back inside my car, but the rebar I'd used to jam the door had sheared off during the crash. The door was sliding open on its own as the train tilted on a curved bank. I grabbed my wrench, my breath coming in ragged gasps. A hand, gray, bloated, and missing 2 fingers, reached around the edge of the door. Then another. The metal groaned as the weight of dozens of them began to pull the door wide. I backed into the corner of the car, the corn dust stinging my eyes. I had nowhere left to run. The lead zombie pulled itself in, its jaw hanging by a single tendon, its eyes fixed on my throat. Behind it, I saw a dozen more, their shadows stretching long across the floor of the car. I raised the wrench, my muscles screaming, as the first one leaped. Undefined. The wrench didn't just hit the thing, it sunk. The rusted iron teeth of the pipe wrench caught the lead zombie right in the bridge of its nose, and the sound wasn't a crack, it was a wet, heavy thud, like a sledgehammer hitting a bag of soaked peat moss. The force of the swing sent a jolt of pure, white-hot agony up my forearm, vibrating through my elbow and settling into my shoulder. I didn't have time to celebrate. The thing's head snapped back, its jaw flapping uselessly, but its momentum carried it forward. It collided with my chest, its cold, dead weight knocking the wind out of me. I slammed back against the pile of corn, the dry kernels acting like quicksand, swallowing my legs and making it impossible to get any leverage. I kicked out, burying my boot in the thing's sternum and shoving. It slid back toward the open door, but 3 more were already stepping over it. The air in the car was thick, a suffocating mixture of rot and the fine, yellow dust of 1,000 bushels of dried corn. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. I scrambled to my feet, my boots sliding on the metal floor. The train was still tilting, the groan of the twisted frame screaming over the sound of the horde outside. The door was wide open now. The rebar I'd used to jam it was a jagged, twisted piece of scrap on the floor. I swung the wrench again, a short, desperate arc that caught the next one in the temple. This one didn't go down. It just stumbled, its eyes, milky and filmed over with cataracts, staring right through me. I realized that. I reached for the heavy chain I'd rigged to the overhead support, planning to swing it like a flail to keep them at bay while I climbed the internal ladder. My fingers wrapped around the cold steel, but when I pulled, the rusted mounting bracket, the one thing I'd banked my life on, sheared clean off the ceiling. The heavy chain collapsed in a heap of useless iron at my feet. My first line of defense was gone. The survival logic I'd lived by for the last 99 days was crumbling as fast as the train car. I backed up, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack a bone. There were 5 of them inside now. The lead one, the one with the broken jaw, was pulling itself up from the floor. Its fingernails, black and jagged, scraped against the metal, a sound that set my teeth on edge. I lunged forward, not with a swing, but a thrust. I jammed the handle of the wrench into the throat of the closest one, using it as a spacer to keep its snapping teeth away from my face. I could smell it, the stench of stagnant water and old blood. I shifted my weight, trying to throw the thing out the open door, but my foot slipped on the wrench hit the floor with a hollow clang. As I reached for it, a hand grabbed my jacket. I felt the fabric tear. I rolled, throwing my weight into a desperate spin, and my hand closed around a piece of the sheared rebar. It was sharp on one end where it had snapped. I didn't think, I just drove it upward. The metal spike went through the underside of the zombie's chin and out the top of its skull. It slumped, its weight pinning my arm down. I tried to yank the rebar free, but it was stuck fast in the bone. I pulled again, my muscles screaming, but it wouldn't budge. I heard a snap, not the bone, but the metal. The rebar broke off, leaving me with a 6-inch stump of iron and a dead body on top of me. I kicked the corpse off and scrambled back, my lungs burning, my vision tunneling. I was trapped in the corner of the hopper. To my left, the wall of the car was buckled inward from the crash. To my right, the rising tide of gray skin and tattered clothes. I looked up. The internal ladder was my only shot. I lunged for it, grabbing the bottom rung. It was slick with oil. My hand slid, but I gripped tighter, hauling my body weight up by sheer adrenaline. I kicked out blindly behind me, feeling my boot connect with something soft. One of them had my ankle. I looked down and saw a woman, or what used to be a woman, clinging to my boot with a grip like a vice. Her teeth were bared, her gums receding in black. I shook my leg, but she wouldn't let go. I took the broken stump of the wrench and hammered it down onto her wrists. 1 hit. 2 hits. On the 3rd hit, I heard the radius and ulna snap, but her fingers stayed locked. I had to stomp. I reached the top of the hopper, bursting through the small hatch onto the roof of the train. The wind hit me, cold and smelling of pine and death. I thought I'd find safety here, but the sight that met me made my blood run cold. The train wasn't just stalled, it was a bridge. The cars were piled up in a jagged line, and the woods on either side were vomiting out thousands of them. They were climbing. I stood on the narrow catwalk, my chest heaving. The wrench was gone. The rebar was gone. I had my knife, a bushcraft blade I'd sharpened every night by the stove, and my hands. My knuckles were skinned raw, bleeding into the grain dust that coated my skin. I looked back toward the engine, a quarter-mile away. If I could get to the cab, I could lock the door. Maybe I could jump-start the prime mover if the fuel lines weren't severed. It was a suicide mission, but staying here was just choosing how I wanted to be eaten. I started to run. The catwalk was only 18 inches wide, and the train was still leaning at a dangerous 15-degree angle. Every step was a gamble. I jumped the gap between my car and the next, a flat car carrying industrial pipe. The pipes had shifted during the crash, held in place by fraying nylon straps. As I landed, the pipes groaned, sliding a few inches toward the drop-off. I didn't stop. I ran along the top of the rusted cylinders, my balance precarious. Halfway across the flat car, a hand shot up from between the pipes. I didn't see the body, just the arm, gray and sinewy, grabbing for my calf. I leaped over it, but my landing was bad. My ankle twisted on the rounded surface of the pipe, and I went down. I slid toward the edge, my fingers clawing at the smooth metal. I stopped just inches from the drop, looking down into the dark. I pulled myself up, my left ankle throbbing with a dull, rhythmic heat. I couldn't run anymore. I had to limp. I reached the end of the flat car and looked at the next hurdle, a tanker car. It was smooth, rounded, and covered in a layer of frozen condensation. There were no handrails on the top, only a narrow walkway on the side. I stepped onto the coupler, the massive hunk of iron that connected the cars. That's when the sound changed. The low moaning of the horde was suddenly drowned out by a high-pitched, metallic screech. The train was moving. Not forward, sliding. The weight of the thousands of zombies leaning against the cars, combined with the incline of the track, was causing the stalled giant to slip. The metal-on-metal scream was deafening. I felt the vibration in my teeth. The gap between the cars began to widen as the couplers strained. I jumped. My hands hit the cold, wet rail of the tanker car, and I swung my body onto the narrow catwalk. I looked back. The flat car was tilting further, the pipes finally snapping their straps. Tons of steel cylinders began to roll, crushing the zombies that were climbing the sides and spilling into the woods like giant toothpicks. The noise was like a mountain collapsing. I held onto the tanker rail for dear life as the entire car shuddered. I moved along the side of the tanker, my fingers numb from the cold. The wind was picking up, whipping my hair into my eyes. I reached the midpoint of the tanker when I saw him. He was huge, a former construction worker, still wearing a tattered high-visibility vest. He was standing on the catwalk, blocking my path. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't staggering. He was braced against the tank, his dead eyes. I pulled my knife. The blade was only 6 inches long. Against this giant, it felt like a toothpick. I moved forward, testing my footing. The tanker groaned again, sliding another foot down the embankment. The giant didn't move. He just waited. I lunged, aiming for the eye socket, but the tanker bucked. My strike went wide, the blade skittering off his cheekbone, carving a deep, bloodless furrow in his gray flesh. He didn't flinch. He swung a massive, meaty fist that caught me in the ribs. I felt the air leave my lungs in a violent burst. I hit the railing, my back arching over the edge. Below me, the ground was 20 feet away, a roiling carpet of reaching hands. I gripped the rail, my knuckles white, as the giant moved in. He grabbed my throat. His grip was like a hydraulic press. I could feel the cartilage in my windpipe beginning to give. The world began to go dark at the edges. My lungs were screaming for oxygen, but the giant's hand was a wall of iron. I dropped the knife. My hands went to his wrist, trying to pry the fingers back, but it was useless. I was dying. I looked into his dead, empty eyes and saw my own reflection, small, terrified, and failing. With the last of my strength, I didn't pull back. I pushed. I threw my weight forward, slamming my forehead into his nose. The impact was sickening. I felt my own skin tear, but the shock caused his grip to loosen for a fraction of a second. The metal hook acted as a lever, tearing through his rotted muscle and snapping the bone. He let out a dry, rattling hiss and stumbled back. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I drove my shoulder into his chest, using the tilt of the train to my advantage. I didn't have time to rest. The screech of the train was getting louder. The tanker car was starting to tip. I looked ahead. The engine was only 2 cars away now, a boxcar and then the tender. But the boxcar was different. The doors were wide open, and inside, I could see movement. Lots of it. It wasn't just a few, it was a nest. The crash must have funneled dozens of them inside when the train first derailed. I stood up, my legs shaking so hard I could barely keep my balance. I had no wrench. No rebar. My knife was gone, dropped somewhere on the catwalk or still stuck in the giant's arm. I was empty-handed. I reached into my pocket and felt the only thing I had left, a single flare and a small, half-empty tin of lighter fluid. It wasn't a weapon. It was a prayer. The tanker car gave a violent lurch. A loud pop echoed through the air, the coupler pin between the tanker and the boxcar had snapped. The gap began to grow. 1 foot. 3 feet. 5 feet. I didn't think. I ran. I hit the edge of the tanker catwalk and launched myself into the air. For a second, I was flying, the dark woods and the sea of zombies blurring beneath me. My hands caught the edge of the boxcar's floor, my fingers digging into the splintered wood. I pulled myself up, but as I rolled into the dark interior of the boxcar, I realized I'd jumped from the frying pan into the fire. The car was packed. I could hear them before I could see them, the wet, clicking sounds of throats trying to moan, the shuffling of feet on wood, the smell of a slaughterhouse in mid-July. I backed against the wall, my hand fumbling for the flare. Outside, the tanker car finally gave way. It rolled down the embankment, a 50-ton cylinder of steel crushing everything in its path before hitting a rock and detonating in a massive, blinding fireball. For a split second, the interior of the boxcar was illuminated. There were at least 30 of them. They were all staring at me. In the center of the car, sitting atop a pile of shredded shipping crates, was something worse. It was a cluster of them, fused together by the heat of some previous fire or the sheer pressure of the crash, a multi-limbed nightmare that let out a sound like a broken organ. The light from the explosion faded, plunging the car back into a flickering, orange-hued darkness. The first one stepped forward, its shadow stretching across the floor like a shroud. I felt the flare in my hand. My thumb found the striker. My heart was a drum, beating out the rhythm of my final seconds. I looked at the sea of dead faces, the twisted limbs, the hungry mouths, and I realized the 100 days didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the next 10 seconds. I braced my back against the vibrating wall of the car, the roar of the fire outside growing, as the entire group began to move toward me in unison. I gripped the flare, the striker ready, as the first pair of cold, dead hands reached for my face. I thumbed the striker. The first 2 swipes gave me nothing but dry, metallic clicks and a shower of pathetic sparks that died before they hit the floor. The cold hands were inches from my throat, the skin on their fingers peeling back like wet parchment. On the 3rd strike, the phosphorus caught. A blinding, chemical crimson erupted in my fist, hissing with a violent, white-hot intensity that scorched the hair on the back of my hand. The sudden flare acted like a physical blow. The front line of the dead recoiled, their milky eyes clouding over as the intense light seared whatever remained of their retinas. They didn't scream, they didn't have the lungs for it, but the air left their chests in a collective. The multi-limbed thing atop the crates, the knot, didn't flinch. It was a bloated, heat-fused wreck of 4 or 5 bodies, their torsos melted into a single, blackened trunk of necrotic meat. It lurched forward, its movement erratic and unnatural because the legs underneath it weren't coordinated. It didn't walk so much as it tumbled toward me, a dozen arms clawing at the air. I didn't wait for it to reach me. The car groaned. The train hit a curve at a speed it was never designed for, and the floor tilted at a sickening 30-degree angle. I slammed into the corrugated steel wall, my shoulder absorbing an impact that made my vision go white for a second. The knot slid with the momentum, its massive, gore-slicked weight pinning 3 other zombies against the opposite door. This was my only window. I scrambled up, my boots slipping on a mixture of spilled grain, black blood, and industrial grease. I reached for the heavy iron pry bar I'd wedged into the door track earlier that morning. My fingers locked around the cold hexagonal steel just as I didn't look down. I kicked back with my free heel, feeling the crunch of a nose and the squelch of an eyeball. The grip loosened. I swung the pry bar in a wide, horizontal arc. The heavy metal had connected with the side of a skull, shattering the temple and sending a spray of gray matter across the grain sacks. I didn't stop. I swung again, and again, working with a frantic, mechanical rhythm. It wasn't about courage, it was about the physics of the lever. Every strike had to be a kill shot because I didn't have the oxygen for a long fight. The air in the car was thickening with the smoke from the fire outside, a greasy, chemical stench that burned the back of my throat. The knot was untangling itself. One of its fused heads, a woman with a jaw hanging by a single tendon, snapped at my thigh. I jammed the burning flare into its open mouth. The phosphorus roared, the heat instantly vaporizing the moisture in the creature's throat. Steam and black smoke erupted from its ears and eye sockets. The thing convulsed, its many arms flailing, and I used the distraction to climb onto the crates. From the higher vantage point, I could see the scale of the disaster. The fire from the engine had reached the third car. The heat was warping the steel plates of my car, making the red paint bubble and peel like blistered skin. The train gave another violent lurch. The sound of grinding metal from beneath the floorboards was deafening, a high-pitched shriek of steel on steel that vibrated through the marrow of my bones. A walker grabbed the hem of my jacket, pulling me down toward the sea of reaching hands. I shed the jacket, letting the dead tear at the empty canvas as I leaped for the overhead cargo net. My fingers burned as they gripped the rough hemp, but I hauled myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. Below me, the knot had recovered. It was pushing itself up, the charred head still smoking. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last of the blasting caps I'd scavenged 3 weeks ago in the rail yard. It was a desperate, stupid move. If I blew the door, I might be sucked under the wheels. If I didn't, I'd be eaten or burned alive. The knot's fingers, blackened and hooked, snagged my boot. I felt the leather tear. I kicked, but the thing was heavy, a literal anchor of dead weight. I looked at the door, saw the flickering orange glow of the exterior fire through the gaps, and made the call. I jammed the blasting cap into a gap in the door's locking mechanism and struck it with the butt of the pry bar. The explosion was small but sharp, a pressure wave that boxed my ears and sent a needle of pain through my skull. The lock shattered. The door, under the pressure of the wind and the swaying of the train, didn't just open, it vanished, ripped off its hinges and flung into the night. A vacuum of freezing air and rushing wind sucked the smoke out of the car, along with the top layer of grain. The sudden change in pressure and the tilt of the car sent the knot sliding. It screeched, a sound like a rusted hinge, as its many limbs tried to find purchase on the smooth metal floor. Its clawed hands raked deep grooves in the steel, but the momentum was too much. It hit the edge of the open door, hung there for a heartbeat as its multiple eyes locked onto mine, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the rhythmic thud of the wheels. I didn't have time to cheer. The car was shaking so violently now that I was being bounced against the ceiling. The coupling at the front of the car was glowing cherry red. It was going to snap. I looked out the open door. We were on a high embankment, the ground falling away into a blur of pine trees and jagged rock. I had to jump. I had to jump now or I'd be inside this steel coffin when it hit the bottom of the ravine. I grabbed my pack, swinging it over one shoulder. I didn't check the contents. I didn't think about the 100 days. I didn't think about the people I'd lost or the things I'd eaten to stay alive. I just focused on the blur of the ground. I timed the sway of the car, waited for the moment it tilted toward the embankment, and threw myself into the void. The wind hit me like a physical wall, knocking the breath out of my lungs. For a second, I was weightless, a speck of dust in the middle of a dying world. Then, the impact. I hit the slope hard. My right leg buckled, the bone in my fibula snapping with a sound I felt more than heard. I tumbled, a chaotic mess of limbs and gravel, the world spinning in a blur of orange fire and black sky. Every time I hit the ground, something else broke or bruised. A rock caught me in the ribs. A branch tore a furrow through my cheek. I slid for what felt like miles until I finally slammed into the trunk of a downed cedar. I lay there for a long time, the world spinning. The sound of the train was a fading roar, followed by a series of thunderous crashes that echoed through the valley. A fireball rose into the sky, lighting up the skeletons of the trees in a hellish, flickering gold. The train was gone. The 100 days were over. I tried to move and immediately vomited from the pain. My right leg was bent at an angle that shouldn't exist. My left hand was a mess of shredded skin and broken fingers where I tried to break my fall. I reached up to touch my face and felt the warm, sticky flow of blood from a deep gash over my eye. My vision was tunneling. The cold began to seep in, not the frantic cold of the wind, but the deep, bone-settling cold of shock. I forced myself to sit up. The movement sent a spike of agony through my chest that made me black out for a few seconds. When I came to, I was staring at the wreck. The train cars were piled up at the bottom of the ravine like discarded toys, a mangled heap of burning steel. I could see shapes moving in the firelight. Things that should have been crushed or burned were crawling out of the wreckage. They were broken, missing limbs, trailing in. I looked at my pack. It had burst open during the fall. My water was gone. My food was a smear of jam and glass shards. I had the pry bar, I'd somehow kept my grip on it until the final impact, and a half-empty box of matches. That was it. No supplies. No shelter. A broken leg and a concussion in the middle of a forest crawling with the dead. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a piece of meat that had been dropped in the dirt. I took my belt off, biting down on my tongue until I tasted copper to keep from screaming, and lashed my broken leg to a sturdy branch of the cedar. Every movement was a battle against the urge to just lie down and let the cold take me. But the sound of the things crawling in the brush, the dry rustle of dead leaves under dead feet, kept me moving. I dragged myself up the slope, using my good leg and my one functioning arm to pull myself through the dirt. Every inch was a price paid in pain. I found a small rock overhang about 50 yards up the ridge, a shallow notch in the granite that offered a sliver of protection from my back. I crawled into it, the rough stone scraping my shoulders. I sat there, the pry bar across my lap, watching the fire below die down into a low, smoldering red. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, a weak, pale light that didn't bring any warmth. It was day 101. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional snap of a twig. I looked down at my hands. They were stained so deeply with grease and old blood that I didn't think they'd ever be clean again. My fingernails were gone, ripped out in the struggle. I tried to ball my hand into a fist, but the nerves just misfired, sending a dull thrum of ache up to my elbow. I wasn't thinking about the future. There was no future. There was only the next breath, the next grip on the pry bar, the next sound in the woods. I reached into my pocket and found a single, crushed cigarette I'd been saving since day 40. It was dry and half the tobacco had fallen out, but I put it to my lips anyway. I struck a match, the small flame trembling in the morning chill. I took a drag, the harsh smoke filling my lungs, and for a moment, the pain seemed a little further away. I looked out over the valley. The dead were still down there, circling the fire. One of them began to climb the slope, its head lolling to one side, its path erratic but certain. It had caught my scent. I dropped the cigarette and ground it into the dirt with my thumb. I gripped the pry bar, the cold steel biting into my palm. My breath hitched in my chest, a ragged, wet sound. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a hope. I just had the bar. The thing came over the crest of the ridge, its jaw clicking, its hands reaching. I braced my back against the cold stone, ignored the scream of my shattered leg, and raised the steel. The 100 days didn't matter. The fire didn't matter. Only the next 10 seconds. I waited until I could see the yellow film over its eyes, until I could smell the rot on its breath, and then I swung. The steel hit home with a dull, final thud. I pulled the bar back, wiped the gore on my pant leg, and waited for the next one. I was still here. That was all there was. That was everything.